They found him under the timbers, mouth full of red dust and blood, hands like a city map trembling as if he could still read contracts through his skin. Nneka held his head in the crook of her arm while the rain knocked bright coins into the puddles of the construction site, and the danfo horns wailed 2 streets away. How would a woman who had never seen the inside of a boardroom save a man who seemed to have fallen from the world of marble and executive jets? And if the man she cradled was not merely another stranger, but the secret center of a fortune that made whole neighborhoods anxious, would her act of mercy make her invisible to the hungry and the avaricious, or mark her forever? She felt the weight of that question like a stone in her throat as she listened to the generator humming across the site, to the soft prayer of a mosque drifting from the nearby courtyard, and then she saw the thin, battered card in his wallet and thought she recognized the letters. Then the rain cut her off. What had she truly found under the timbers? Nneka had learned to measure the world in concrete and small mercies. She rose at dawn before Harmattan breath could dry the sweat into dust, braided her hair with oil to stop the dust, and stood on planks where others feared to stand, fitting rebar with hands that remembered the feel of her mother's palms. She had a brother, Chiki, and a little girl across the compound, Nneka, whose evening homework she could sometimes help with if the night shift let her go early. Her values were blunt and honest: work, family, the kind of prayer whispered under the dust-stiffened sky, and she believed that a promise to someone was as binding as mortar. The construction site at Ibeju, near the red earth that smelled of rain, was her world, and the men she worked with moved around their lives with the familiarity of animals knowing their tracks. She knew their jokes, their grudges, and the names of their children, and she knew how little people like her could be trampled by larger plans. How a billionaire fell in love with a female construction worker who saved him, she thought in a cold flash, was not a story she expected to live. Yet the first night with the injured man in her hands changed the angle of every day to come. She tightened her grip around his wrist and wondered why fortune had put that shivering hand in her lap. The inciting moment came when the scaffold gave beneath the man, and the whole makeshift platform screamed like something alive. Planks snapped and a metal beam swung like a pendulum, and Nneka, with a reflex learned from hauling cement sacks for 6 years, pushed a boy out of the path and grabbed the man's collar, feeling a bone crack under her palm. He had a face that was more ordinary than she expected, pleated lines of worry, a beard mottled with dust, but the wallet with the embossed crest and thin letters had felt heavy in her hand even as she called for someone to fetch water and a first aid box. The foreman, Mr. Sewell, barked orders in a voice that could flatten a prayer. Someone called an ambulance, but the roads were jammed with danfos, and the nearest clinic's generator hummed like a caged beast. As they lifted the man, Nneka looked into his eyes and saw a flicker of recognition that did not belong to a stranger. She held on to that flicker even as the crowd closed in, because when very big people fall, very small things change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for worse, and she could already feel the shape of trouble tightening at her heels. Trouble began as small hurts, pay cut notices slipped under the lunchbox, the promise of overtime evaporating like morning mist, and the client's lawyer visiting the site in expensive shoes that left no dust on the concrete. Nneka's hands, which had lifted beams and spread mortar, were suddenly noticed in a way that made her uneasy. Men in suits looked at her as if she were a tool they might keep or discard. The first cost was simple. Chick's tuition missed for a month, and Nneka felt the hot need to make it right by putting in extra night shifts, which doubled the risk of injury. She started to sleep with her uniform on, boots by the door, because work was the only place that let her be flesh and purpose. Then a woman from a local NGO, Madame Bolanle, arrived with curry lunches and smooth words about legal aid and relocation for the workers. She smiled with teeth like white stones and offered to help place Nneka in a training scheme that promised steady wages. Too good, Nneka thought as the woman's eyes slid to the landowner's office and the river of paperwork that flowed from it. Why did help always smell faintly of sale? The thought sat like grit in her mouth, then hardened into suspicion as the foreman took the woman aside and they whispered. What were they planning without her consent? The first real betrayal came from the man who had been kindest of all. Engineer Sulaiman, the site's nominal overseer who had once given her tea at dusk and said, "Your hands are honest." When the contracts began to shift and the company announced that the site would be closed for safety audits, Nneka watched him sign papers in a ledger with a calm that felt like a blade. He praised her skill in front of the inspectors, then, later, without looking her in the eye, wrote her name in a list of redundancies because the new, glossy contractor wanted experienced labor with less low. Cal entanglement. The wolf in sheep's clothing made his move. He pretended to be her mentor, offered to recommend her for the same training scheme Madame Bolanle had touted, and then used her recommendation to grease another man's promotion, one who would accept lower pay and louder silence. Nneka's stomach turned. The red earth after rain seemed to mock her with its bright, clean smell, because the ground she stood on was no longer safe. How could someone who had held a cup of tea with her be the hand that closed her gateway to work? She fought back with the tools she knew: sweat, early mornings, the stubborn dignity of a woman who refused to be priced out of her children's future. She showed up when the site reopened, when the new contractor brought polished foremen and loud promises, and she worked with a frenzy that rattled the dust off the scaffolding. But the costs escalated. Late notices from the landlord, a threatening letter stamped with the developer's crest that said the compound would be sold to make way for progress, and Ifunanya's cough which dragged at Nneka's nerves like a hook. There was a pattern interrupt when the city's mayor visited the site with cameras and a ribbon, praising the urban renewal projects and standing under the blue sky to have his picture taken with shining hard hats. The glossy men smiled with their new teeth and then walked away while the workers returned to old, unpaid debts. A week later, the developer's bulldozers came at dawn, and Nneka, holding an eviction notice, watched a line of men with batons treat a sleeping compound as trespassers. Each blow made her choices narrower, and she felt the strange cruelty of being both essential and dispensable. How many of her days would the city demand before it was done with her? The bulldozers stopped for 3 hours when a small figure stood between them and the earth, and people paired her name like prayer. What would happen if she refused to move? Pattern interrupts came in the form of weather and rumor. The harmattan shifted to rain and the site became a theater where mud spat and people had to balance between puddles of their lives. A viral video of her, arms up, holding a collapsible girder as if the world would topple if she let go, made her a minor hero in a neighborhood that had no history of heroes with calloused hands. That clip was a splinter that someone with easier pockets took and made into leverage. A local paper ran a piece about the brave builder, and an anonymous benefactor promised legal backing. But then the paper's editor was seen at a dinner given by the contractor, and the benefactor's check never cleared. Nneka felt the dizzying rise of attention like a wind that could carry her or throw her into the chasm of public spectacle. She kept hearing the injured man's uneven breathing in the back of her mind from that night under the timbers, and she could not shake the impression that he had been more than what he'd seemed. Who was he, really, and why did his presence unbalance the men who wanted her gone? It was in that fermented moment of press and pressure that Nneka's small, clear act of kindness took root and would, in time, change the geometry of power around her. The injured man, whom she had hauled out when the scaffolding screamed, had no place of his own for a week, and she shared her mat with him in the site's abandoned office, gave him one of her last pieces of Gary because she had a mother's instinct for feeding weakness, and sat with him under the generator's hum as the rain hammered the corrugated roofs. She cleaned the wound at the back of his head with boiled water and herbs Chaiki's mother had taught her, smoothing the bandage with fingers that smelled of mortar and memory. That night she listened to whatever light confession he offered and found him quiet an oddly tender thanking her with a voice like a man who had long been unaccustomed to being rescued. What mattered was not the thanks but the witness. Someone else had seen a nameless woman choose mercy, and that sight would travel. The man tucked the folded piece of paper into her palm, a card with a name she didn't recognize, and said quietly, "For your kindness." And she kept it, even when the world tried to buy her silence, because some debts must be repaid without exchange. Would that kindness be a blessing or a danger? Time compressed into deadlines. The city's paperwork gave the contractor 3 days to clear the informal compound or face fines, and the eviction crew was due by dawn on the 3rd day, which meant creditors' letters, Ifunanya's school fees unpaid, and Chaike pressed to take an extra shift that would leave Nneka alone with bricks and worry. The contract the new developer clung to demanded that the workforce sign novelty waivers or their names would be struck from payroll, a crooked formality that would make redress impossible when pensions came due. Nneka counted bills under the light of a borrowed bulb and calculated the life of a woman who could be pushed onto the pavement by fancier rhetoric. Losing the site meant losing everything she had built for Ifunanya and Chike, and the thought threw bile up into her throat. They had to be out by dawn, the notice said, and if they did not move, restorative measures would happen. The word felt like a bruise. Nneka folded the little card the injured man had given her into the hem of her apron and, with the weight of a deadline on her spine, decided she would not go quietly. The 2nd day felt like a drum roll, and then the hidden identity was revealed in a way that reframed everything. The man she'd bandaged and warmed was not merely an injured passerby, but Obiora Aze, the reclusive owner of Easy Holdings, a conglomerate whose logos were in the ledger that had netted the developer his contract. His face was on the morning paper the next hour as a philanthropist, but the photograph in glossy magazines showed him in suits and private jets, not under a torn tarp at a rain-sodden building site. He stepped onto the site the morning before the eviction, unannounced, wearing the same dusty trousers she had cleaned and a cap pulled low, and when he removed that cap, he looked at her with eyes stripped of pretense. "You saved me," he said quietly, and in that phrase the power equation shifted like tectonic plates. She felt a strange, dizzy power in being known by someone who could buy the skyline and still chose to stand on the muddy ground. The revelation was not only about his money, hidden billionaire or not, but about what it meant for him to be found, grateful, and changed. She realized that her act had been witnessed by a man whose choices could unmake the contractor's legal teeth or sharpen them. Would she accept help that could erase the dignity of her fight, or would she demand that mercy be given without strings? Gathered when choices arrived that did not fit her values. Offers of relocation came with clauses that would erase any claim to back wages, and Obiora, who could have simply bought the land back and made everyone whole, hesitated because his board required due process and the image of impartiality that suited them better than swift charity. The wolf, engineer Sulaiman, tried to manipulate that hesitation into leverage, offering to broker Nneka's silence for a finder's fee and a job that would keep her off the streets Bishal. You'd also keep her from speaking about the illegal additions to the contract he had signed. Nneka stood in the rain in the compound courtyard and felt the wet smear of red earth on her boots as Ifunanya's cough leaned against the thin paper of her nerves. She thought of the card in her apron and of the man who had told her the truth of who he was. In the darkest moment, when the bulldozers lined up like sleeping beasts and her family's future flickered like a candle in wind, she chose the only thing that had always mattered, truth and dignity, and refused to sell out for comfort. She would not trade her voice for a clean bed. She would not let Ifunanya grow up learning that dignity was negotiable. When she chose that path, the climax moved like swift water. She took the card to Obiora and, in a voice that found courage from somewhere deep, demanded he use his name to stop the eviction and expose the corruption in the contracting chain. not to pay her ransom, but to right the wrongs. Obiora, whose private life had been a map of closed doors, found himself answering. He walked into the mayor's office with boots still wet from the compound and, on camera, spoke plainly, naming the developer and the engineers who had falsified safety reports for profit. Television vans lined the street and the generator hummed like an orchestra as the city's pulse was exposed. Engineer Sulaiman, caught on record negotiating kickbacks, found his signature traced into a dozen incriminating papers and was escorted away while neighbors watched in stunned silence. His sheep's smile evaporated under the flash of authority. The bulldozers stopped. The contractor's license was suspended. Legal teams began to parse restitution. The city felt for the first time in many months a small justice land on its shoulders with the sound of a dove. In the next beat of the story, consequences landed on screen in visual, undeniable ways. The developer's tall office windows reflected not pride but panic as auditors arrived, their papers shuffling like angry birds, and the men who had sought to buy the compound's bones were filmed packing their files into briefcases. Sulaiman's name was read on the radio, and his family watched neighbors whisper. He lost his job, his reputation splintered, and the men who had stood to profit from eviction faced court summons with evidence gathered by Obiora's legal team and Nneka's testimony. The contractor's CEO issued a public apology that smelled of vinegar and paper, but paper and public apologies could not erase the site that had been nearly crushed. Restitution checks flowed not to a single hand, but into a fund managed by a community board set up under Obiora's insistence that would guarantee work opportunities and pensions for the workers displaced. The moment justice was felt was physical. The men who had been beaten into submission straightened their shoulders, mothers who had packed away dishes for fear of the developer's men brought them out, and Ifunanya's cough eased as the clinic they were directed to was granted a generator by Ize Holdings. The taste of relief was like bread after a long fast. The resolutions that followed were not fairy tale clean, but they were real and rooted. The compound was saved and formalized as a cooperative building project, with plans displayed on a plywood board, where once only eviction notices fluttered. Nneka was offered a position as head of on-site training, not as a token, but because she had the skill and the authority, and she used her role to create a micro-scholarship for Chaik and a maintenance stipend for Ifunanya. Obiora insisted the funds be transparent, and he refused to be lauded as a savior. He insisted on labor contracts be fair and renewable, and he sat on the site with workers at dawn, hands still catching the air that smelled of red earth after rain, listening rather than lecturing. The city changed its urban renewal language to include local voices because a viral clip and a woman's steadfast courage had made the public intolerant of shadow deals. Nearby markets hummed with renewed bustle, generators hummed with new purpose, and the mosque courtyard pulsed with communal thanks. Nneka began, with a small team, to register a builders' cooperative that would teach women how to read blueprints and manage payrolls. Her life still bore the marks of struggle, but the arc had bent so that her work now fed more than one family. In the new normal, there was contrast in the smallest details. Where once she had eaten cold gari under a leaking veranda, she now sat with Obiora and a group of workers to sign contracts on a wooden table that had been sanded smooth by many hands. Where a danfo horn had once meant delay and the threat of lost wages, the same street now saw Obiora's old Range Rover, dusted like everything else in the city, stop by the site, and someone in nice shoes step out to hand over a check and then kneel to shake a worker's hand. The richness of that life was not the marble in a boardroom, but the steady rhythm of wages that arrived on time, sons and daughters enrolled in school, and the small bakery down the road that could now afford to hire another apprentice. Nneka's family mended in tangible ways. Chiki's tuition resumed. Ifunanya's cough was checked by a doctor who charged less because the clinic's generator was no longer a gamble, and their mother, who had been ill, could be visited without fear of rent collectors. The wound under the timbers had closed, and in its place grew a scaffolding of shared enterprise that bore the weight of more than one dream. Kindness had been the seed, and truth had been the water. The clear lesson was simple and stubborn. Kindness given without expectation can open doors you never knew were locked, and truth, even when slow and costly, will rearrange the powerful if enough people bear witness. Never judge a life by the shape of its first chapter. Sometimes the person with calloused hands holds the map to a better future. If this story moved you, leave a comment with your thoughts. Share a time when someone's quiet courage changed your life. And if you want more modern folktales from across Africa, subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll be back with another evening tale. 2 weeks later, the rain seemed to have learned a gentler rhythm, and the Abeju site wore the careful calm of a project that had learned to breathe with its own heartbeat. The boards scrubbed clean of mud, and a new sign announcing the Builders Cooperative in bold, hopeful letters, as if a village dream could be measured in blueprints and payrolls. Nneka arrived before dawn, not just to count wages, but to test the trust that had been earned in blood and grit, sweeping dust from a table where Obiora's name now rested beside hers on every safekeeping binder, and she felt the weight of being watched in a way that did not sting but steadied. Someone with a private fortune who could walk away at the push of a button had chosen to stay in the hum of the morning generator and the rustle of the workers' overalls. The city's people moved with a careful civility around the site, the kind of hush that comes when someone you once doubted is now your ally, and the danfo horns outside had learned to fade into the background, replaced by the soft clack of nails and the clink of coins in the ever-present need to prove that every naira earned would have a home in a child's school fees and a grandmother's medicas. But the interval had shifted something deeper. A new pair of eyes watched the process, not to condemn it, but to judge its fairness. The eyes of the press, yes, and of a steady, invisible witness who wore a different kind of wealth, the kind that never shouted but could redraw lines on a map of power. The first signal came not in a flare of validation, but in a test. A routine audit that looked like a threat at first glance, with a stack of forms and a lawyer's insinuating smile. And Nneka, who had learned to bend with wind but never break, stood between the ticking clock and the ledger, asking for time to reconcile figures that refused to lie down. Then came the mid-morning shock, when a courier slipped a sealed envelope onto the site gate, the handwriting inside the seal, a cascade of unfamiliar letters that spelled out a name she had learned to fear and then learned to trust. A donor who preferred to stay unnamed, a fund that promised safety nets but asked for careful eyes to govern it, a test of whether mercy could become governance or simply good luck dressed in gentler clothes. "We don't walk away from a fight, we walk through it," Obiora said, his voice low enough that only the rubber tread shoes near him could hear, and he offered her a choice. Accept the distant polished world's help and risk losing the very sense of belonging she had fought so hard to keep, or keep the community's nerve intact by refusing to let a check buy silence. The choice pressed, like a hammer on a nail, then loosened as he stepped toward the workers and spoke in a voice that carried over the hum of the generator. "If we must take help, we will demand transparency. We will demand accountability. We will write the rules ourselves." The workers murmured, and Nneka felt a small, stubborn flame kindle in her chest. She did not want to become a museum piece in a philanthropic gallery. She wanted to stay a builder of futures, one careful brick at a time. The interval's new pressure sharpened the old edge of injustice. The corridor of the contractor's office, once filled with polite smiles and the soft clink of keys, now carried the echo of a threat disguised as paperwork, a demand for signe documents and signatures that would bind the workers into silence while siphoning off future benefits into someone else's vault. A quiet tactic surfaced, Suleiman's ghost, not in flesh, but in the same old playbook. A whispered rumor that a managerial reorganization would be used to cut offsets and schedules to move the most vulnerable workers into dimly lit corners of the project where pay could be trimmed and accountability avoided. And the rumor wasn't a rumor at all, but a test, a way to see whether Nneka would bow to fear or stand on the platform she had carried under the timbers and refuse to surrender. In the middle of the day, a hush fell as a local journalist, the kind whose camera lens can turn a yard into a confession, arrived with a notebook full of questions and a footer that read, "What does fair work look like in a city where the rich watch and the poor sweat?" Nneka, never one to court media unless it served truth, answered with breath and clarity, saying, "Fair work is work that lasts beyond a single project, that keeps the child in school and the mother in her home, that makes a promise worth keeping long after the job is done." The journalist nodded, not with condescension, but with the respectful curiosity of someone who sees a future in a woman who does not cower at a ledger's glare. Yet even as the day closed on those words, a second, sharper pivot appeared. The anonymous donor's envelope contained not only a pledge but a demand, a charter that would turn the cooperative into a formally run foundation, with a board that included outsiders and outsiders' rules, a structure that would render the workers' voices ill but cushioned by audits and reports, a safety net that could, in time, swallow the community's own choices if left unchecked. The line between ally and overlord twined around the edges of the page and burned there like a brand. Help that binds, help that blesses, help that buys silence. Nneka stared at the seal and the neat handwriting and heard the old question in her own throat. What does mercy cost when power wears a friendly face? As the day bled into evening, the town's early stars bled through a sky already crowded with the silhouettes of cranes and the skeletons of the new houses marching toward the river, and the interval's twist, the foundation's charter, began to reveal its own paradox. It could secure a future for Ifunanya's schooling and Chaik's tuition. It could guarantee pensions and steady wages that would outlive many seasons, but it could also distant shield the very people who had nurtured the site from the hard, unglamorous work of daily justice, turning the cooperative into a glossy page in a corporate brochure rather than the living, breathing village it had become. Nneka walked with Obiora along the edge of the debris-strewn yard, listening to the quiet, heavy sounds of a city that chooses what to overlook with a practiced ease. And she asked him softly, "What if the world tries to own this by naming it a foundation?" He replied, equally soft but with a stubborn fire, "Then we will own the foundation's rules and make sure the money serves the people who built the site, not the people who write the stories about it." The last light slid along the edge of the boarded walls as a new dawn seemed to hold its breath, and a small voice from the crowd, Amina, one of the older women who had pressed a handkerchief to Ifunanya's cough and learned to count breaths as a form of prayer, raised a question that some would call a dare. If a foundation can keep teeth, peace, who will keep the workers from becoming the foundation's footnotes? It was a question that would outlive the envelope and demand, in future days, a living answer. By nightfall, the site had become a stage for the next act of a long, hard play. The cooperative's first full staff meeting, the first public sharing of the audited accounts, and the first visible role for Nneka as a trainer who could translate brick and beam into blueprints for every woman who wanted to stand where she stood. The city's lights glittered on the highway like a line of bright promises, and the soundscape carried the scent of ground nut soup from a nearby stall and the distant thump of a party that would never forget how the underdog showed the world a different kind of wealth, one earned by risk, by refusing to be bought, and by turning kindness into a shared responsibility. The interval's twist, that charter and its stranger's governance, would endure. The public would judge and rejudge. The workers would learn to count not just wages, but governance credits. and Obiora, who had learned to walk with the storm, would keep walking. His steps, a quiet reminder that power, when used for fairness, could become a force that makes a whole neighborhood believe again in the possibility of justice. The last line of this beat rests not as a triumph, but as a hinge. The board's first decision to publish minutes and invite independent observers will either seal the cooperative's future or lay bare the limits of mercy when money speaks. And in the cool night air, Nneka feels the stone in her throat soften into resolve, because the story's path is never fully laid until the dawn shows whether the people have kept faith with themselves and with the dream they fought to save. If this story moved you, leave a comment with your thoughts. Share a time when someone's quiet courage changed your life. And if you want more modern folktales from across Africa, subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll be back with another evening tale.